The Apogee of Empire, 1512 to 1590 Part 2. The conquests of Belgrade and Rhodes were doubly important. In the first place, they established Suleiman's reputation as the Sultan, who had succeeded where his great ancestor, Mehmed the Conqueror, had failed. Secondly, both places were strategically important. Belgrade, at the confluence of the Danube and the Sava, was the key to the conquest of Hungary from the south. Rhodes occupied a position commanding the sea lanes leading from the Mediterranean into the Aegean and, in particular, the route between Istanbul and Egypt. Suleiman's next expedition exploited his victory at Belgrade. Diplomatic relations with Hungary had not improved, and then, in 1525, the Janissaries rebelled, with the complaint that the lack of campaigns had deprived them of the opportunity for bonuses and plunder. In 1526, Suleiman led his army into Hungary and, on 29 August, routed the Hungarian army at Mohacs. Ottoman artillery fire had proved fatal to the Hungarian heavy cavalry. In September, Suleiman entered Buda, the Hungarian capital, leaving it 10 days later and precipitating a crisis which was to occupy him throughout his reign. It was a crisis, too, in Anatolia that had forced his quick return to Istanbul. At the moment when the imperial army was victorious in Hungary, a rebellion had exploded in central Anatolia, requiring a major force to bring it under control. Then, in 1527, a second and more ferocious uprising under the leadership of a millenarian dervish called COLIN defeated the army that Suleiman had sent for its suppression. It required the political skills of the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, to defeat the rebels. The problem was that 1522 had seen the Ottoman annexation of Dulgadir, and the execution of its last independent ruler, Shah Suvarolu Ali. At the same time, the fief holders of Dulgadir had lost their fiefs, leading many of the dispossessed to join COLIN's rebellion. By promising them the return of their fiefs, Ibrahim Pasha detached them from the core of the rebels, whose depleted ranks he overcame in battle. This was not the last rebellion. There were further uprisings in the Cukurova in 1528 and, for the rest of the century, it was only by establishing a network of informers, particularly against Safavid sympathizers, that Suleiman and his successors maintained order in Anatolia. 42. The major political crisis, however, was in Hungary. King Lajos had lost his life at the Battle of Mohacs, and, when Suleiman left the country in 1526, the Hungarian throne was vacant. In November, the Hungarian estates elected John Sapala I as his successor. However, the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, Charles V, and brother-in-law of King Lajos, did not accept the decision and, in December, had himself crowned King of Hungary. The arbiter in the dispute was the victor of Mohacs, and, in 1528, Suleiman unsurprisingly accepted Sapala I as king. Ferdinand rejected the decision and occupied Buda. Suleiman's campaign of 1529 was the beginning of an Ottoman-Habsburg conflict that was to last into the 20th century. The Sultan marched to Hungary, reoccupied Buda and, in the autumn, laid siege to Vienna. Hampered by the weather and the determined defense, on 14 October, Suleiman withdrew. In 1530, Ferdinand besieged Buda again. He was unsuccessful, but his occupation of the western part of the Kingdom of Hungary and his continuing claim to the Hungarian crown made it necessary for Suleiman to intervene once again on behalf of King Sapala I. The campaign was not one of conquest. The Ottoman army succeeded only, after a long siege, in capturing Kusig and carrying out raids into Styria, but it was sufficient to force the Habsburgs to seek a truce. An agreement of 1533 confirmed the existing division of Hungary, with Ferdinand and Sapala I ruling their respective territories as Ottoman tributaries. The truce made it possible for Suleiman to undertake a campaign against the Safavids, for which two events had supplied a pretext. First, in 1528, a Safavid governor of Baghdad had offered the city to the Ottomans and, although Shah Tahmasp I had executed him shortly afterwards, the offer formed the basis for a continuing claim. Second, the Safavid governor of Azerbaijan, Ulema Tekelu, had defected to the Ottomans in 1530 and, at the same time, engineered the disgrace of Sharaf al-Din of Bitlis, who then offered his allegiance to Tahmasp I, ordering Ulema to capture Bitlis, which he never did. Suleiman prepared a campaign. In 1533, the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha retook Bitlis and, in 1534, occupied Tabriz with no resistance from the Shah. In the same year, Suleiman joined Ibrahim Pasha in Tabriz, and then led the army to Baghdad, which surrendered at the end of November, again with no resistance. 43 From Baghdad, the army undertook a difficult march across the Zagros Mountains to Tabriz. By the time of the Sultan's return to Istanbul in 1536, he had added to the empire Baghdad, Erzurum and, temporarily, Van. Despite his success on land in securing his western border and in expanding his territories in the east, Suleiman clearly realized that his sea power was not equal to that of the combined Christian navies. In particular, the Spanish fleet based at Messina and the ships of the Knights of St. John remained a constant danger, and it was presumably with this in mind that he invited Hayreddin Barbarossa to come from Algiers to serve as admiral. The threat from Spain materialized 2 years later when, in 1535, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, personally led an expedition against Tunis. This Spanish victory, together with the outbreak of war with Venice in the following year, led Suleiman to accept the proposals for an alliance coming from the French king, Francis I, who needed an ally against his archenemy, Charles V. In 1537, Suleiman and Francis planned a combined attack on Habsburg territories in Italy. Francis was to invade Lombardy, while Suleiman launched a seaborne attack from Albania on the Kingdom of Naples, with assistance from the French fleet. The plan failed. Francis did not invade Italy, and in August, instead of invading Naples, the Sultan laid siege to the Venetian island of Corfu, sending raiders against Brindisi and Otranto, which he withdrew when there was no news from the French king. The siege of Corfu was also a failure, and in September, Suleiman retreated. Nonetheless, the war with Venice continued. In 1538, Barbarossa captured most of the Venetian islands in the Aegean which had remained in Venetian hands, including Naxos, Paros, Santorini, and Andros. The Venetian response was to seek allies and, in February 1538, the Holy League of Pope Paul III, Charles V, Ferdinand of Austria and Venice came into being. Its moment came later in the same year when, after the Spanish capture of Kodor on the Dalmatian coast, its combined fleet, under Andrea Doria, trapped Barbarossa's ships in the Gulf of Prevesa. The battle which followed was Barbarossa's most famous victory. After defeating the Allies, he recaptured Kodor, forcing the war to a conclusion in 1540. By the treaty of that year, Venice ceded to Suleiman the islands which Barbarossa had captured in the Aegean, as well as Monemvasia and Navplion in the Peloponnesos. Suleiman in the meantime had led his troops in 1538 against the Voivoda of Moldavia, Petru Rares, who had not paid the tribute due to the Sultan, and whom Suleiman suspected of collaborating with Ferdinand and inciting the King of Poland. In consequence of the invasion, Suleiman annexed southeastern Moldavia, including the port of Bendri on the Dniester, so completing the land link between Istanbul and the Crimea. The 1540s saw a renewal of Ottoman Habsburg conflict, and again, as in the previous decade, its focal point was Hungary, with a subsidiary theater of war in the Mediterranean. The source of the conflict was a treaty which Ferdinand of Austria had concluded with King Sapalai in 1538. By its terms, each recognized the other's territory, but Sapalai's lands were to pass on his death to Ferdinand, making him the sole ruler of Hungary. In 1540, King Sapalai died, leaving an infant son whom the Bishop of Varad, George Martinuzzi, contrived to have elected as king at Buda. Ferdinand at once tried to make good his own claims and, in September, laid siege to Buda. The operation was a failure, but nonetheless his army captured Vac, Visegrad and Sakashvayar. In 1541, he tried again, but Martinuzzi resisted for long enough for the Sultan's army to rout the besiegers. At the end of August, however, when the Janissaries occupied the citadel of Buda, it became clear to Martinuzzi that Suleiman did not intend to make him regent in Hungary. Instead, the Sultan appointed an Ottoman governor-general to the central part of the Old Kingdom of Hungary, and nominated the infant John Sigismund as King of Transylvania, the eastern part of the Old Kingdom, under the tutelage of Martinuzzi, who, thwarted in his ambition, made contact with Ferdinand. Ferdinand's siege of Buda was only one of the Habsburg actions against Suleiman in 1541. In the same year, to coincide with the assault in Hungary, and hoping no doubt to repeat the success that he had gained at Tunis in 1535, Charles V led an attack on Algiers. The enterprise ended in disaster. Following Hassan Aga's repulse of the besiegers, a violent storm destroyed much of the Spanish fleet. The Habsburg offensive of 1541 led not only to defeat in the field, but also encouraged Francis I of France to renew the alliance with Suleiman against their common Habsburg enemy. In the late summer of 1542, as Ferdinand's army attacked Buda for the third time, a French ambassador was conducting negotiations in Istanbul. He returned with the agreement for a joint action in 1543. In the spring of this year, Suleiman led his army into Hungary, extending his border to the west of the Danube with the capture of Valpo, Siklos, Pécs, Székesfehérvár and Esztergom. In the meantime, his fleet under Hayreddin Barbarossa's command stormed Nice and spent the winter in the French port of Toulon. However, threatening the appearance of Suleiman's fleet in the Western Mediterranean may have seemed to the Habsburgs, the danger was momentary. Barbarossa had relied on French support, and a peace between Charles V and Francis I temporarily put an end to Franco-Ottoman cooperation. In Hungary, however, the war continued. Suleiman himself led no more expeditions, but in 1544, the Governor-General of Buda captured more Habsburg fortresses, including Nógrád, Hatvan and Simontornya to the northeast of Buda. In the same year, Ferdinand made the first moves towards peace. In 1545, he and his brother Charles V sent ambassadors to Istanbul. In 1547, they concluded a 5-year treaty with Suleiman, which confirmed the territorial status quo. Ferdinand, however, renounced his claim to the Kingdom of Hungary, and agreed to pay 30,000 ducats each year for the Hungarian territory which he continued to rule. For Suleiman, the treaty also had a symbolic significance, since the text no longer refers to Charles as emperor, but simply as King of Spain, and it was from this moment that the Ottoman Sultan considered himself to be emperor of the Romans and Apos, or Caesar.